Welcome to Southern Farming Systems Frost Economic Scenario Calculator. This tool is designed to help you work through the scenarios for your farm and calculate the impact frost has on your farm business's bottom line. The calculator allows you to enter your farming business's systems details and step through the frost impacts you have experienced or potential scenarios, allowing you to compare up to 5 different management scenarios. The calculator categorizes frost impact into 3 zone types: the green zone, the amber zone, and the red zone. The green zone is an area that has no frost risk and the business isn't impacted at all by frost. There is no need to adopt any frost mitigation or avoidance strategies, and to do so would severely reduce its ability to push production or yield and grow high value crops in this zone. Conversely, the red zone are areas that are frequently or severely damaged by frost. If a grower adopts the same management decisions as in the green zone in the red zone, then this is likely that large losses will occur. In between the green and the red zone, we have the amber zone. The amber zone sometimes gets frosted, but mostly doesn't, and in the absence of frost, has a production capability like the green zone. To get started with the tool, we scroll down the bottom of the introduction page, and here we have 2 options. The first option is just to select Next, which will take us to a blank calculator file which you can parameterize with your own data. Alternatively, you may have some data from an earlier run or somebody else has supplied you with data. You can use this import calculator data file feature, which is what we're going to do now to preload some existing scenario runs. So we click Import Calculator, we go to the file where we've stored the JSON file, and we select the file that we'd like, click Open. You'll see the page reload, and we're ready to start with the calculator. To move to the next section, press Next. The first section is the Farm Areas tab. Here we set the baseline parameters for our farm scenario. Here we are using a total farm area of 1,000 hectares, which is allocated between the green, amber and red zone. In this scenario, we're using 5% of the farm as green zone, or 50 hectares, 80% of the farm is amber zone, or 800 hectares, and 15% of the farm, or 150 hectares, is the red zone. When you hover your mouse over each of the input boxes of the green, amber and red, you can see that a reminder comes up to help you remember what the definition of each of these zones are. To move to the next tab, press Next. The next tab is the Enterprises tab. This is where we select all the enterprises that are going to form the basis of our scenario analysis later on. Here we have selected 6 different enterprises: spring wheat, barley, canola, beans, oat and hay, and milling oats. For each one of these enterprises, we create a simple gross margin. First, we think, what is the yield potential of that commodity in the event that it is not frosted? Or, what is the unfrosted yield? Here we have selected 6 tonnes per hectare for wheat. What is the on-farm price that you expect to receive for this commodity? In this case, we're using $250 per tonne for wheat. And what are the total variable costs associated with that commodity? Here we are using $350 per hectare for wheat. That provides us with a total gross margin per hectare of $1,150 per tonne for wheat. If we scroll down the page, we also can input salvage options. These salvage options allow us to do something different with the enterprise, if we so choose, once a certain frost damage threshold is reached. At the moment, we haven't got any salvage options selected for any of the enterprises. But for example, if we wanted to compare our spring wheat enterprise to spring wheat with a salvage option, which may be hay in the event that a damage threshold is reached, we can add in a new enterprise. Perhaps we call it wheat salvage. Now, this will have the same gross margin in the event of an unfrosted enterprise as our wheat example above. So 6 tonne per hectare grain yield, $250 per hectare price, and $350 per hectare variable costs, giving us the same gross margin. If we scroll down the bottom though, we can now assign a salvage option, which is in this case is hay. So in the event of frost damage, we are prepared to go out and cut this crop for hay. Let's set the damage threshold at 50%, which means the frost damage has to be 50% or greater before we will select the hay option. We can also select a maximum area that we want to apply this salvage option to. In this case, we might only be willing to cut up to 200 hectares of hay. From this point, we need to think of the hay gross margin as a new gross margin, as if hay was the enterprise in itself. So here, the hay yield we expect might be 10 tonne per hectare. The on-farm price, $150 per tonne. And the variable costs associated with all the operations associated with the hay might be $600 per hectare. These variable costs must include all the costs associated with the enterprise from start to finish. For example, the cost of sowing the crop, fertilising, weed control, as well as all the costs associated with cutting, raking, baling and storing hay at the end. So that's how we could create enterprises and, if we so wish, salvage options for our different enterprises. Let's move to the next tab to continue our way through the calculator. The next step in the frost calculator is to assign a frost impact to each enterprise. The frost impact is the amount of production lost in the event of a frost event. For example, 50% frost impact is 50% yield loss. 100% frost impact is 100% yield loss. For each enterprise, we need to fill out this table that categorises the frost yield impact in different season scenarios, moving from least frosty year to the frostiest year, and also within each zone. So our green zone, our amber zone and our red zone. While this part of the calculator seems quite complex, we've taken a few steps to try and make it a simpler exercise to fill this part of the calculator out. So if we start with our first enterprise, which is spring wheat, you'll see here this is a sentinel enterprise, meaning when we fill this table out, if we so wish, we can use this table to pre-fill all the frost impacts in the other enterprises. So you can see for wheat, In the green zone, we're not expecting any frost impact in any of the frost season scenarios listed on the left-hand side. In the amber zone, we're moving from no impact in the least frosty scenario to 100% impact in the frostiest year. However, in the red zone, we're expecting some level of frost impact regardless of what type of season we receive. So in the best case scenario, or the least frosty year, we're still expecting 15% frost impact. In the frostiest scenario, we're expecting total yield loss of 100% in the frostiest year. You can check in the columns to the right of the frost impact percentages what that does to the yield that was selected originally in the gross margin enterprise. So for example, a 15% frost impact is changing our yield from 6 tonne per hectare unfrosted to 5.1 tonnes per hectare with 15% frost damage. Where we've had 100%, obviously that we're receiving no wet yield in those areas. If we scroll down the page, we can continue to fill out the tables for our different enterprise options. For barley, we can choose to scale off our sentinel crop, which is wheat. By putting a figure of 80%, what we are saying is that we think the impact of frost to barley is about 80% of what the impact of frost is to wheat. So therefore, the figures that are placed in the frost impact boxes, or the percentages of frost impact, are scaled off our original entry for wheat. So in this case, in the red zone, where wheat was 15% impact in the least frosty year, we're expecting barley to be impacted by about 12%. In the frostiest year, where wheat was impacted by 100%, we're expecting that barley will only be impacted by 80% and therefore is achieving some level of yield of 1.3 tonne per hectare, where wheat was achieving 0. We can continue down with all our enterprises, and we can choose to continue to either fill out the tables independently, or we can scale off what we have already inputted for wheat. So you can see where we've added this new enterprise in before, wheat salvage. We haven't got any frost impact yet occurring in our table. We can change that very quickly. Choose to scale off our sentinel crop. We're choosing 100% because we want it to be the same as the wheat above, and therefore our table is now filled out for our frost impact values, ready to use in our scenarios later on in the calculator. So now we have entered in all the background farm area, enterprise gross margins and frost impact data, and we are now ready to start looking at scenarios and the outputs of those scenarios. So up the top we can see we have scenario 1, scenario 2 and the output tabs, and we're going to be switching between those few tabs to undertake the scenario analysis. So what we have is two scenarios currently. Our first scenario we're going to call our baseline scenario. So what's the farm currently doing? You can see here that all the enterprises that we have previously parameterized are selected, available to allocate area to. And in this middle column here, we need to go through and allocate an area of each enterprise across the total farm area. So in this case, spring wheat is making up 40% of the area of the farm, or 400 hectares. Barley, 10%. Canola, 40%, beans are 5%, and oat and hay are 5% of the total area. You can see here what total hectares they represent, and then based on the proportions of the green, amber and red that we have previously entered, those hectares are split proportionally so that each enterprise is represented in the green, the amber and the red zones. If we then set up scenario 2, we move to the scenario 2 tab. Here we've got the same baseline parameters as scenario 1. So scenarios are really open to your imagination, but here we're going to do a very simple scenario, and we're going to compare the whole farm gross margin when in scenario 1 we have spring wheat that gets frosted, but in scenario 2 we're going to replace the spring wheat area with area that we're prepared to salvage with hay in the event that frost occurs. So over here you can see that we've moved our area that was allocated to spring wheat, and the only change we've made is moving that area and allocating it to the wheat salvage option. If we move into our output tab now, this is where the comparisons are made. So again, we have our seasonal frost outcome from least frosty year to frostiest year, and listed here is the total farm gross margin for both scenario 1 and scenario 2, and what the difference between those gross margins are relative to scenario 1. This is also displayed graphically, where in the first chart, scenario 1 is the blue line and scenario 2 is the orange line. Along the bottom are our deciles, frost deciles, which is least frosty year through to frostiest year. So as you can see, where we don't have frost, there's very little separating these two scenarios. As we experience more and more frost, or our frost decile increases, we're starting to see a difference between scenario 1 and scenario 2. If we look at what that difference is in scenario 2 minus 1, we can see that scenario 2 is adding significant profit of at least $50,000 extra total whole farm gross margin when we're prepared to select the hay option compared to just taking the frost damage as it comes. And in the worst case scenarios, or the most frostiest years, this is adding additional profit to the whole farm gross margin of in excess of $200,000 per year. Say we wanted to go back and add an additional scenario to compare to the two scenarios that we have here. We can go back to scenario 2. We scroll down to the bottom below the output table and we add scenario. Now you can see that we have scenario 3 in our plans. So if we set this to our baseline scenario as before, 40%, 10%, 40% canola, 5% beans, 5% oat and hay, we have now set the scenario to the equivalent of scenario 1. A good thing to check when you're entering data in these tables is to make sure that the totals add up down the bottom as expected. For example, 100% land area and the total hectares equaling 1,000 hectares, which was our baseline scenario. If we make a mistake and say allocate too much area to one enterprise that goes beyond 100, you can see down here that goes to 105%, which needs rectifying. So just something to keep an eye on. So in this scenario, what we might do is allocate some of the cereal yield back to a milling oats. But we're only going to do this because the milling oats have less frost susceptibility. We're only going to do this in the red zone. So at present we have 60 plus 15 hectares of wheat and barley growing in the red zone, and what we are going to do is manually adjust this red zone and add the 75 hectares that were wheat and barley growing in the red zone. We're now going to grow milling oats on that 75 hectares. If we go over to our outputs tab, we can now see an additional scenario has been added in. You can see that the green line now is scenario 3, so it's adding extra profit in above the blue line, but in the worst case frost scenarios, or the most frostiest years, it is outperformed by scenario 2, which was cutting hay in those frosted impact areas. We can also see there is a new differential. This new differential being scenario 3 minus 1. So you can see by adding in milling oats in the worst affected frost areas, which is zone red, and replacing those milling oats with wheat and barley crops, it's generating a profit of up to about $70,000 per year additional in the total farm gross margin. So you can see how the frost economic scenario calculator can be used to build up a picture of your whole farm gross margin and undertake scenarios which allow you to compare what will happen at the whole farm level if you choose to alter management factors that mitigate the impacts of frost.